Under the pale winter moon, Officer James Sullivan kneels beside a fresh grave, his weathered hand resting on the cold granite marker. For 15 years, Rex had been more than just his canine partner. They were inseparable, a legendary team known throughout the department for their uncanny ability to find the lost. Now, after Rex's passing, Sullivan refuses to leave the cemetery, drawn by an inexplicable feeling that his partner isn't truly gone. As midnight approaches, a ghostly mist begins to coil around the headstone, taking a familiar shape that makes Sullivan's heart skip a beat. Could it be that death itself isn't strong enough to keep a devoted canine from his final mission? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The framed photograph sat prominently on Officer James Sullivan's desk for 15 years, a younger version of himself standing proudly beside a German Shepherd pup, both of them looking uncertainly at the camera on their first day together. Sullivan remembered thinking Rex seemed too small for police work, all legs and oversized ears. The canine trainer had laughed at his hesitation. Sometimes the best partners come in unexpected packages, Sullivan. That morning in early spring had changed everything. After 20 years of standard patrol work, Sullivan had finally earned his shot at the K9 unit. At 45, some thought he was too old to start handler training, but Sullivan knew better. He'd spent his entire career preparing for this moment, studying every K9 team he encountered, volunteering at local shelters, learning the intricate language of working dogs. Rex had been the runt of his litter, nearly passed over for service training. But there was something in those intelligent eyes that caught Sullivan's attention, a quiet intensity, an old soul's wisdom in a young dog's body. During their first training exercise, while other handlers struggled to establish basic commands, Rex watched Sullivan with unwavering focus, anticipating his instructions before he gave them. "Never seen anything quite like it," the head trainer admitted, watching them work. "That dog reads you like a book, Sullivan." Their connection deepened through months of rigorous training. Sullivan spent every free moment with Rex, taking him home on weekends, teaching him to trust, to think, to work as one. They learned each other's rhythms, strengths, and limitations. Where Sullivan's aging knees sometimes slowed him down, Rex compensated with boundless energy. When Rex's enthusiasm threatened to overwhelm his discipline, Sullivan's steady presence brought him back to center. They graduated at the top of their class, but it was their first real case that proved they were something special. A 3-year-old had wandered away from a camping site in the state park, and after 12 hours of searching, hope was fading. Standard search patterns had yielded nothing. But Rex caught a scent others had missed, leading them 2 miles off the main grid to a shallow cave. The child was cold and frightened but unharmed. "How did you know to look there?" the search coordinator asked afterward. Sullivan just shook his head, watching Rex accept modest praise with dignified patience. "I didn't know. I trusted Rex. That's the whole secret, knowing when to trust your partner." That case established their reputation, but it was only the beginning. Year after year, they refined their partnership until they moved like a single organism in the field. Rex learned to communicate with subtle signals, a slight change in his breathing pattern, a particular tilt of his ears, a specific cadence to his bark. Sullivan learned to read these signs as clearly as written words. They became the team everyone called for the impossible cases, the ones where hope had nearly run out. Children lost in storms, elderly wanderers with dementia, hikers who had strayed too far from marked trails. Rex found them all. Sullivan lost count of the lives they saved together, but he never forgot the look of relief on families' faces when Rex led them to their loved ones. The photograph on Sullivan's desk captured none of this future. It showed only possibility, a man and a dog, at the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. But Sullivan kept it there all those years because it reminded him that the greatest partnerships often start with a leap of faith, a willingness to see potential where others might not look. Now, standing in his office for the first time since Rex's passing, Sullivan touched the frame gently. The glass was dusty. He'd been away too long, lost in his grief. But Rex's eyes in the photograph still held that same intensity, that same promise of unwavering loyalty. Sullivan hadn't known then that he wasn't just getting a partner, he was meeting his best friend, his most loyal companion, the other half of his professional soul. The precinct had changed around them over the years, but this corner of Sullivan's office remained a testament to their journey together. Certificates of commendation lined the walls, newspaper clippings highlighted their most memorable saves, and a shelf held the numerous awards they'd earned. Yet it was this simple photograph that captured the essence of their bond. Two uncertain beginners who would become legendary together. The police radio on Sullivan's belt crackled with static, the same radio that had carried their final call. He could still hear the dispatcher's voice clear as day. "All units, we have a missing child, 6 years old, last seen near Hawkins Creek. Temperature dropping below freezing. Time is critical." It had been a bitter December evening, the kind that turned breath to ice and numbed exposed skin within minutes. Sullivan remembered checking Rex's protective boots one last time before they headed out. Even at 13, Rex's enthusiasm for work hadn't dimmed, though his muzzle had greyed and his pace had slowed. They both had more grey than not these days. "This might be our last winter working together, buddy," Sullivan had said that morning, watching Rex carefully navigate the icy steps outside their home. The department had been hinting about retirement for both of them, but neither was ready to admit their time was ending. The missing child was Sophie Chen, a first grader who hadn't returned from playing in her backyard. Her mother had looked away for just 5 minutes while answering a phone call. 5 minutes, that's all it took for a curious child to vanish into the approaching darkness. They arrived at the scene as light was fading. Other K9 units were already working the perimeter, but the combination of cold weather and growing darkness was hampering their efforts. Rex, however, seemed energized by the urgency. He pressed his nose to Sophie's purple winter coat, then lifted his head with purpose, that familiar intensity burning in his eyes. Sullivan knew that look. "What do you see, boy? Show me." Rex led them away from the other search teams, past the creek where everyone assumed Sophie had wandered. The old dog moved with surprising speed, pulling Sullivan through dense underbrush. Something about Rex's urgency felt different this time, more desperate, more insistent. They picked up a trail near an abandoned railroad trestle, Rex's pace quickening despite the treacherous terrain. The temperature kept dropping, and Sullivan's flashlight beam caught scattered snowflakes beginning to fall. If they didn't find Sophie soon, the weather would make it impossible. The radio squawked again. "All units be advised. Approaching storm. System. Heavy snow expected within the hour. Command considering suspending ground search until morning." Sullivan keyed his radio. "K9 Unit 7 here. Rex has a strong trail heading northeast of the trestle. Request permission to continue." There was a pause before dispatch responded. "Negative, Unit 7, storms moving in fast. All units return to command post." But Rex was pulling harder now, whining with an urgency Sullivan had never heard before. In 15 years of partnership, Rex had never been wrong about a trail. Sullivan made a decision. "Unit 7 copying," he radioed, then switched off the device. "Okay, Rex, show me." They pushed deeper into the woods, the snow falling heavier now. Rex led them up a steep embankment, his aging joints struggling, but his determination unwavering. Near the top, he suddenly stopped, ears forward, body rigid. Then Sullivan heard it, a faint whimper carried on the wind. They found Sophie huddled in a hollow beneath a fallen tree, confused and hypothermic, but alive. Sullivan wrapped her in his jacket and radioed their location. As they waited for backup, Rex stood guard, his body shielding them from the worst. Of the wind and snow, None of them saw the weakened tree limb above, its branches heavy with ice. Sullivan heard the crack too late. In the last instant, Rex lunged forward, pushing Sullivan and Sophie clear as the massive branch came down. The impact was devastating. By the time the rescue team reached them, Rex was barely breathing. Sullivan cradled his partner's head, begging him to hold on, but those wise eyes told him everything. Rex had made his choice, the same choice he'd made every day of their partnership, to protect, to serve, to save. Sophie survived without lasting harm, but Rex died in Sullivan's arms, his final act one of ultimate sacrifice. The department radio, still attached to Sullivan's belt, captured his last moments. The desperate calls for medical support, the arrival of help too late, and finally, the official end-of-watch call for K9 Officer Rex, badge number 2274. Now, days later, that same radio sat silent on Sullivan's desk, its speaker dark, its last transmission etched forever in his memory. He hadn't turned it on since that night, couldn't bear to hear. Another call, knowing Rex wouldn't be there to answer it. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he swore he could still hear an echo of their final dispatch, a ghostly reminder of a partnership that had become legend. Rex's stainless steel. Food bowl hadn't moved from its corner in the kitchen since that night. Sullivan couldn't bring himself to put it away, or to wash it. The last few pieces of kibble still rested at the bottom, untouched, like artifacts in a private museum of loss. Every morning, his feet would carry him to that corner out of habit, muscle memory refusing to accept what his heart knew to be true. The house felt wrong now, its familiar spaces altered by absence. No click of nails on hardwood greeting him at the door, no warm body pressing against his leg while he made coffee, no gentle snoring from the bed by the fireplace. Sullivan found himself walking through rooms with the lights off, as if darkness might hide the empty spaces Rex had left behind. His colleagues tried to help in their way. Captain Martinez had insisted he take extended leave. "As long as you need, Jim. The job will be here." Detective Chen, Sophie's mother, brought him meals he couldn't eat and gratitude he couldn't bear to hear. Even the new K9 handlers stopped by, awkwardly offering condolences while avoiding looking at Rex's unused leash still hanging by the door. But it was the nights that tested him most. 30 years of police work had taught Sullivan to be alert, to unusual sounds, to trust his instincts when something felt off. Now, in the hollow quiet of his house, those instincts were working overtime. He could have sworn he heard the soft pad of paws in the hallway, the gentle creak of Rex's bed as he settled for the night. Once, half awake at dawn, he was certain he felt the familiar weight of a head resting on his knee. "You're losing it, old man," he muttered to himself, but the incidents kept happening. The back door he always locked somehow standing open in the morning. Rex's favorite tennis ball rolling across the floor with no breeze to move it. The strange way his coffee mug had shifted on the counter, leaving a ring of moisture in the exact spot where Rex used to bump it with his nose, demanding attention. Sullivan found himself talking to the empty rooms, something he'd never done before. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" The silence that answered felt different now, expectant, almost alive with unspoken meaning. He tried returning to his normal routines, but everything reminded him of Rex. The morning jog route they'd run together for years felt longer now, lonelier. The park where they'd practiced tracking exercises was impossible to visit. Even the grocery store brought memories. Rex sitting patiently outside, earning smiles from passers-by, always rewarded with his favorite treat from the butcher's counter. The department psychologist suggested he was experiencing normal grief, perhaps complicated by the traumatic nature of Rex's death. "It's common," she explained, "to think we're sensing the presence of those we've lost. Our minds seek patterns in randomness to help us cope." But Sullivan had seen too much in his career to dismiss his instincts so easily. The morning he found Rex's badge, the one buried with him, sitting on his bedside table, he knew something more was happening. He'd watched them place that badge in the casket himself, had seen it lowered into the ground. Its appearance in his house defied rational explanation. When he brought it to the cemetery, intending to return it to Rex's grave, the groundskeeper's reaction gave him pause. "Strange things happening lately," the old man admitted, checking over his shoulder before continuing. "Security cameras picking up weird mists at night, temperature drops in one specific spot, even on warm days. And I could swear I heard barking yesterday, but when I checked, there wasn't a dog in sight." Sullivan found himself returning to the cemetery more frequently after that conversation. He'd sit by Rex's grave for hours, watching the shadows lengthen, feeling that same expectant quality in the air. Sometimes he'd catch movement in his peripheral vision, but whenever he turned to look, there was nothing there. Just an impression of something familiar vanishing around a corner. The rational part of his mind argued against what he was experiencing. Ghosts weren't real. Dead partners didn't come back. But in his gut, where he'd always carried his strongest instincts as a cop, Sullivan knew better. Rex had never let physical barriers stop him from doing his job in life. Chain-link fences, locked doors, raging rivers had all proved surmountable when duty called. Why should death be any different? Still, Sullivan kept these thoughts to himself. He'd seen how the others at the precinct looked at him now, with pity, with concern, whispering when they thought he couldn't hear. Poor Sullivan, taking it harder than expected. Maybe it's time for him to think about retirement. You know how it is with canine handlers, they get too attached. But they hadn't known Rex like he hadn't learned to read every subtle shift in his behavior, every meaningful glance. So when Sullivan began to feel that familiar pressure against his leg in empty rooms, or catch the scent of Rex's fur on windless nights, he stopped questioning it. Instead, he waited, knowing with growing certainty that his partner was trying to tell him something important, something that couldn't wait, even for death. The cemetery's security footage would later show an unusual phenomenon, a dense, low-lying mist that seemed to move against the wind, coalescing around Rex's grave at precisely midnight. But Sullivan didn't need video evidence to validate what he experienced that night. Some memories burn themselves into your soul, becoming part of who you are. He hadn't planned to stay so late. The evening had started like any other visit, with Sullivan sitting beside the grave, talking softly about nothing in particular. The moon hung full and bright overhead, casting long shadows between the headstones. The air held that peculiar stillness that sometimes comes before a storm, though the forecast had predicted clear skies. "I miss you, boy," Sullivan whispered, his hand resting on the cold granite. "The house is too quiet without you. The job—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know if I can go back without you." The first sign that something was different was the sudden drop in temperature. Sullivan watched his breath cloud in the moonlight, though it was a mild spring evening. Then came the scent, that distinctive mixture of German shepherd fur and the special shampoo he'd always used on Rex. So familiar it made his heart ache. The mist gathered slowly at first, wisps curling around the base of the headstone like curious fingers. Sullivan remained perfectly still, years of canine handling having taught him the value of patience. The fog continued to build, taking on a shape that made his chest tighten with recognition. The proud arch of a neck, the alert set of pointed ears, the distinctive slope of a back he'd watched traverse countless miles of difficult terrain. When the form finally solidified, Sullivan found himself looking into eyes he'd never thought he'd see again. They held the same intelligence, the same devotion that had marked their 15 years together. This was no trick of grief-stricken imagination. Rex sat before him, translucent in the moonlight, but undeniably present, his outlines softly luminescent. Against the darkness, "Rex?" Sullivan's voice cracked on the name. The spectral dog's tail wagged once, deliberately, in the specific pattern they'd developed over years of work. 2 quick sweeps meaning yes in their private language. Sullivan reached out instinctively, then hesitated, afraid his hand would pass through the apparition. But Rex pressed forward, and though there was no physical contact, Sullivan felt a familiar warmth spread through his palm, like holding it near a gentle flame. The ghost of his partner stood, moving with the fluid grace of his younger years, free from the arthritis that had plagued his final months. He took several steps toward the cemetery gate, then looked back at Sullivan with unmistakable urgency. It was the same look he'd given hundreds of times in the field, when he'd found a scent and needed his handler to follow. "You've got something to show me?" Sullivan asked, falling naturally into their working pattern. Another deliberate tail wag confirmed his suspicion. Rex moved a few more steps, waiting patiently as Sullivan got to his feet. Even as a spirit, he maintained the impeccable training that had made him legendary among canine handlers. He didn't forge ahead or show frustration at his handler's slower pace. He simply waited, glowing softly in the darkness, ready to lead the way as he had so many times before. Sullivan checked his watch. Midnight exactly. The witching hour, his grandmother would have called it. The time when the barrier between worlds grew thin enough for messages to pass through. He almost laughed at himself for such fanciful thoughts. But then again, he was following the ghost of his canine partner through a moonlit cemetery. Perhaps folklore deserved more credit than he'd given it. As they reached the gate, Rex's form began to fade slightly, like a radio signal growing weak. The spectral dog looked back one more time, and in that moment Sullivan saw something in his partner's eyes that sent a chill through him, not fear or sadness, but a fierce determination. Whatever had brought Rex back through the veil of death was no simple matter of unfinished business. This was something vital, something that required the skills and trust they'd spent 15 years perfecting. Sullivan straightened his shoulders, feeling the old familiar surge of purpose that had marked the beginning of their most important cases. "Lead the way, partner," he said softly. "Whatever you need to show me, I'm with you." Rex's form brightened momentarily, as if in approval, then turned toward the darkness beyond the cemetery gates. Their last case together was about to begin. The child's mitten lay in the frost-covered grass just outside the cemetery gates, a tiny red beacon against the dark ground. Sullivan might have missed it if Rex's ghostly form hadn't led him directly to it, nose pointing with the same precision that had made him the department's most reliable tracking dog. It was a child's left mitten, hand-knitted, with a small bell. Sewn to the cuff, Sullivan pulled a latex glove from his jacket pocket. Old habits died hard, and carefully picked up the mitten. Despite the near-freezing temperature, the wool felt unexpectedly warm to his touch. The bell gave a soft chime that seemed to hang in the still night air. Rex's spectral form grew more distinct, his attention fixed on the mitten with an intensity Sullivan recognized from their most urgent cases. The ghost dog's nose twitched, a gesture so familiar it made Sullivan's chest ache. Then he looked up at his partner with clear purpose. "What is it, boy? Who does this belong to?" Instead of responding directly, Rex's form shifted, creating a series of images in the mist around. Him, Sullivan watched, transfixed, as shapes formed and dissolved. A small figure walking alone, a remote structure barely visible through trees, a window illuminated by a faint light. The images moved like an ethereal slideshow, telling a story Sullivan and couldn't quite grasp. "Someone's lost," Sullivan murmured, the realization hitting him with certainty. "That's why you've come back. There's a child out there somewhere." Rex's tail wagged twice, yes, and the urgency in his ghostly eyes intensified. The spectral dog paced in a tight circle, a behavior he'd always exhibited when time was critical in their searches. Sullivan felt his police instincts kick in, years of training taking over despite the supernatural nature of his partner's return. He examined the mitten more closely under his flashlight beam. The wool was high quality, the knitting intricate. Someone had made this with great care, Near the cuff, partially obscured by the bell, he found what he was looking for, a name tag sewn into the seam. "Property of Emily Winston," he read aloud. Rex's form flickered brightly at the name, confirming Sullivan's suspicion. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving automatically to dial the precinct. Then he hesitated. How exactly would he explain this lead? That his deceased K9 partner's ghost had led him to evidence in a case he shouldn't even know about. As if reading his thoughts, Rex moved closer, his ethereal form casting a soft glow on Sullivan's phone screen. An image formed in the mist again. The same small figure, but this time Sullivan could make out more details. A young girl, no more than 7 or 8, curled up in what looked like a confined space. The image wavered, then dissolved, but the message was clear. Whatever questions or doubts Sullivan had about his sanity could wait. A child's life was at stake. He dialed Martinez's direct line, knowing the captain often worked late. After 3 rings, a familiar gruff voice answered. "Sullivan, it's nearly 1 in the morning. Captain, I need to know if we've had any missing persons reports in the last 24 hours. Specifically a girl named Emily Winston." A long pause followed. "How do you know about that case? It just came in 2 hours ago, and you're still on leave." Sullivan looked at Rex's ghost, which had moved a few feet away and was indicating a direction with his whole body, pointing like he used to do when he'd picked up a strong scent. "Let's just say I received a tip. What do we know about her disappearance?" Martinez sighed, but Sullivan could hear papers rustling. "Emily Winston, age 8. Reported missing from her grandmother's house on the north side of Cedar Grove, around sunset. Search teams are already out, but with these temperatures..." He left the sentence unfinished. "I think I can help find her," Sullivan said, watching Rex's form grow more distinct as he spoke the words. "But I need you to trust me, Captain, and I need you to not ask too many questions about my source." Another long pause. "This have something to do with why you've been spending so much time at the cemetery?" Sullivan gripped the mitten tightly, its warmth seeming to pulse against his palm. "Yes, sir, and I know how it sounds, but right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is, there's a little girl out there who needs our help." Rex's ghost had moved further away, his luminous form beckoning with increasing urgency. Whatever window of opportunity they had was clearly closing. "Please, Captain, when have I ever steered you wrong on a missing persons case?" Martinez's response, when it came, carried the weight of 15 years of trust. "All right, Sullivan, what do you need?" Sullivan's police badge caught the moonlight as he placed it on Martinez's desk, the gold shield reflecting years of service in its worn surface. The captain stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at his oldest friend with concern etched deep in his features. "You're really going to do this? Go off-grid based on..." Martinez struggled to find the right words. "Based on what you think Rex is telling you?" "Not think, Tom. No." Sullivan's voice carried the quiet certainty that had marked his most successful cases. "I know how it sounds. If I were you, I'd probably have me committed. But that little girl doesn't have time for us to debate my sanity." The precinct felt different at this hour, empty except for the skeleton night shift. Through the office windows, Sullivan could see Rex's ghostly form waiting in the parking lot, barely visible to human eyes, but unmistakable to him. The spectral dog sat at perfect attention, just as he had during their years of service together. "The search teams have already covered the area where the mitten was found," Martinez said, tapping the evidence bag on his desk. "Multiple K9 units. No trace of her scent, because they're looking in the wrong place." Sullivan leaned forward, his voice low. "Rex isn't leading me to where she was. He's showing me where she is now. But I can't do this officially, Tom. The minute I try to explain my source to the search coordinator, we lose precious hours." Martinez ran a hand over his face, the gesture familiar from countless late-night cases. "And if you're wrong, if this is just grief playing tricks on your mind, your career, then my career ends. I can live with that." Sullivan straightened. up feeling the weight of his decision. What I can't live with is ignoring Rex when he's trying to tell me something this important. Not after 15 years of him never being wrong. The captain picked up Sullivan's badge, turning it over in his hands. Through the windows, a cloud passed over the moon, momentarily dimming Rex's ethereal outline. You know protocol requires me to report this, to send units to check out your lead through official channels, by which time the trail will be cold. Sullivan checked his watch. The temperature's dropping fast, Tom. That girl's been out there for 6 hours already. Rex is getting more agitated by the minute, and I've never seen him wrong about a timeline. Martinez set the badge down with deliberate care. I can give you 4 hours. After that, I have to log this conversation and dispatch units to your last known location. And Jim, he fixed Sullivan with a stern look, your radio stays on. You check in every 30 minutes. You even think you're getting close to finding her. You call for backup immediately. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Captain. Sullivan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd known Martinez for 30 years, had stood as best man at his wedding, but this level of trust still humbled him. And Sullivan? Martinez called as he reached the door. If you're right about this, if Rex really is, he shook his head, just bring her home safe. That's all that matters. Outside, Rex's ghost greeted him with renewed energy, the spectral form practically vibrating with urgency. Sullivan checked his gear one last time. Flashlight, first aid kit, thermal blanket, spare radio battery, all the equipment that had accompanied them on hundreds of searches before. Okay, partner, he whispered, falling into their familiar pattern. Show me what you've got. Rex's form started moving north, away from the standard search grid. Sullivan followed, noting how his partner's ghostly figure seemed to grow stronger as they left the city lights behind. They moved with the synchronized rhythm of their working days, Sullivan reading Rex's subtle cues, just as he always had. In his pocket, the found mitten seemed to pulse with residual warmth, like a compass pointing toward its owner. Sullivan had worked enough missing persons cases to know the statistics, how drastically survival chances dropped with each passing hour in cold conditions. But he'd also learned to trust Rex's instincts above all else, even statistical probability. His radio crackled softly, Martinez setting up a private channel for their communications. Sullivan appreciated the gesture, knowing it put the captain's own career at risk. Trust, he reflected, watching Rex's luminous form guide him into the darkness, was a two-way street. Just as Martinez was trusting him now, he had to trust that. His partner, even in death, was leading him towards something vital. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting long shadows across their path. Somewhere ahead, Sullivan knew a little girl was waiting to be found. And protocol or not, natural or supernatural, he and Rex had never failed to bring a lost child home. The old search grid maps spread across Sullivan's dashboard, their creased surfaces illuminated by his flashlight beam. Red lines marked where previous teams had already covered, methodical patterns sweeping out from Emily Winston's last known location. But Rex's ghost was leading them well beyond those boundaries, into terrain that made Sullivan's experienced eye wary. This can't be right, he muttered, watching his partner's luminous form weave between bare trees. They'd been moving for almost an hour, the temperature dropping steadily. His thermometer read 28 degrees and falling. She couldn't have made it this far on foot. Rex's response was to pause, turning back with that particular tilt of his head that had always meant, trust me, I know what I'm doing. Even as a spirit, his body language remained remarkably clear to Sullivan's trained eye. The radio crackled. Check-in time, Sullivan. What's your 20? About 3 miles northeast of the original search area, he reported, studying his GPS. Following a possible lead through Miller's Ridge. A pause. That's impossible. We had units sweep that entire sector. Ground's too rocky there for reliable tracks. Sullivan watched Rex's ghost move purposefully toward a steep incline. Maybe that's exactly why we need to check it again. Kid might have been trying to throw off pursuit. At 8 years old, you'd be surprised what fear can make people capable of. Sullivan tucked the maps away and grabbed his gear. Next check-in in 30 minutes. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed. Loose shale made every step treacherous, and the beam of his flashlight seemed to dim against the deepening darkness. Rex's spectral form provided some illumination, but the ghost dog kept flickering like a faulty lamp, his outline becoming indistinct whenever they changed direction. Sullivan's knees, already stiff from the cold, protested each upward step. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and this kind of rough ground search had been difficult even in his prime. Still, he pushed on, watching Rex's every movement for clues. Halfway up the ridge, his partner suddenly stopped, ghost form pulsing with increased brilliance. Sullivan approached carefully, scanning the ground. There, partially hidden under fallen leaves, scuff marks on a rock face, roughly the height an 8-year-old might make. "Good boy," he breathed, the praise automatic even now. Rex's tail wagged, but his spectral body seemed to be growing fainter. Sullivan felt a spike of concern. Was there a limit to how long his partner could maintain this form? How much time did they have before... A gust of wind cut through his jacket, carrying stinging particles of ice. The weather was deteriorating faster than forecast. He keyed his radio. Sullivan, checking in early, found signs of recent passage on Miller's Ridge, requesting thermal imaging equipment if available. Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing but white noise. The ridge must be blocking transmission. They were on their own. Rex whined, a sound Sullivan hadn't heard since his partner's death, and pushed forward along the ridgeline. But something was wrong. The ghost dog's movements had lost their certainty, his form wavering more frequently. He would start in one direction, then double back, his spectral nose working the air as if trying to catch a scent that kept slipping away. Sullivan felt his heart sink. In 15 years of searches, he'd seen this behavior only a handful of times. When conditions deteriorated so badly that even Rex's extraordinary tracking abilities were compromised. But how could a ghost be affected by weather, unless it wasn't the weather affecting Rex? Sullivan studied his partner's fading form with growing concern. What if this manifestation had limits? What if each minute Rex spent on this side of the veil was draining whatever ethereal energy allowed him to appear? "We're losing the trail, aren't we, boy?" he asked softly. Rex turned to him, and in those ghostly eyes, Sullivan saw something that chilled him more than the freezing wind: uncertainty. For the first time since this strange journey began, his partner seemed genuinely worried. Sullivan checked his watch, almost 2 hours gone, and the temperature still dropping. Somewhere out there, Emily Winston was trying to survive in these conditions. But with no radio contact, a failing trail, and his spectral partner growing weaker by the minute, Sullivan faced a veteran searcher's worst nightmare: the knowledge that making the wrong choice now could cost a child's life. He looked at Rex's wavering form, remembering all the times they'd faced seemingly impossible odds together. "Okay, partner," he said, his breath frosting in the beam of his flashlight. "If we can't follow the trail, we need to think like her. Where would an 8-year-old go in these conditions?" Rex's ghost flickered once more, but his stance steadied. They'd lost trails before, but they'd always found another way. Death itself hadn't stopped their partnership. They weren't about to let a little bad weather end it now. The night vision footage Sullivan's body camera captured during those hours would later show something remarkable: a faint, dog-shaped luminescence moving through the darkness, its form seeming to strengthen whenever they changed course. But in the moment, Sullivan was focused entirely on reading his partner's increasingly subtle signals, drawing on 15 years of experience to interpret every flicker and fade of Rex's ghostly presence. "Think, Jim," he muttered to himself. watching Rex's spirit attempting to catch some ethereal trace of their quarry. "What do you know about Emily Winston?" The case notes flashed through his mind. 8 years old. Missing from her grandmother's house. Last seen wearing a blue winter coat, jeans and red mittens, one of which now rested in Sullivan's pocket, still maintaining that inexplicable warmth. But it was what wasn't in the official report that caught his attention. The scuff marks they'd found weren't random. They showed a deliberate pattern, like someone trying to climb rather than simply passing through. Emily wasn't just wandering lost. She was heading somewhere specific. "Rex," he called, softly, and his partner's ghost solidified slightly at the tone. It was the voice Sullivan always used when he'd figured out something important during a search. "We've been following her trail, but maybe we need to think about where she's going." Rex's form brightened perceptibly, ears forward in that familiar pose of intense concentration. Sullivan pulled out his topographical map, letting his flashlight play across the elevation lines. The ridge they were on led to higher ground, but there was something else. "There," he breathed, pointing to a mark on the map. "Old fire tower, about half a mile up. High ground, possible shelter." He looked at his partner. "What do you think, boy? Would a scared kid head for the highest point she could see?" Rex's tail wagged twice, their old signal for affirmative, and his spectral form began moving with renewed purpose. Instead of trying to track an increasingly cold trail, they were now anticipating their quarry's destination. Sullivan felt a surge of hope. This was how they'd always worked best, combining his human reasoning with Rex's uncanny instincts. The ghost dog's movement patterns changed, becoming more efficient. Rather than casting about for traces, Rex led them along the easiest possible route up the ridge, the path a tired child might naturally follow. Every so often, his spectral form would pause, waiting patiently while Sullivan navigated particularly treacherous stretches of terrain. The wind had picked up, driving ice crystals that passed straight through Rex's luminous shape, but stung Sullivan's exposed skin. His body camera, still faithfully recording, was gathering frost around its edges. The temperature had dropped another 3 degrees. Suddenly, Rex froze. His ghost form brightened intensely, ears rigid, tail extended, the exact pose he'd always struck when he'd caught a strong scent. But something was different this time. Instead of moving forward, he turned to Sullivan and projected a series of images into the swirling snow. A metal structure, rusted stairs, a small figure huddled in a corner. "You can see her?" Sullivan asked, his heart racing. "She's in the tower." The images flickered again, more urgently this time, but Rex's actual form was starting to fade. The effort of projecting these visions seemed to be draining whatever supernatural energy allowed him to manifest. His outline became increasingly transparent, like fog burning away in morning sun. "Don't fight it, partner," Sullivan said quickly, recognizing the desperate look in those ghostly eyes. "Save your strength, you've shown me enough." He could see the tower now, a skeletal silhouette against the night sky. Rex's form had diminished to little more than a faint glow, but the spectral dog still forged ahead, each step seemingly requiring more effort than the last. Sullivan felt a tightness in his chest, remembering similar moments in their working. Days when Rex had pushed himself beyond exhaustion to complete a mission. "Ease up, boy," he called softly, using the same tone that had always calmed his partner's excessive drive. "I can take it from here." Rex's ghost paused, turning back one last time. In that moment, despite the supernatural nature of their reunion, Sullivan saw simply his partner. Faithful, determined, unwavering in his duty. The spectral dog's form was barely visible now, but his eyes still held that familiar intensity, conveying a message as clear as any verbal command. Find her. Then Rex's ghost faded completely, leaving Sullivan alone in the howling wind. But the veteran K9 handler didn't hesitate. His partner had led him this far, had quite literally returned from death to put him on the right path. Now it was up to him to complete their mission. Sullivan adjusted his gear and started toward the tower. Behind him, his body camera continued recording, its night vision capturing the last wisps of luminescence dissolving into the darkness. A faithful partner's final gift to guide the way. The property deed Sullivan found nailed to the fire tower's base told a story of abandonment. The land had passed through 3 generations of the Whitaker family before being sold to the Forestry Service in 1987. But it was the handwritten note, scrawled in the margin, that caught his attention. Tower condemned, unsafe for public access. As of 4/15/24, the structure loomed above him, a skeletal giant creaking in the wind. Rust had eaten away at the metal supports, and several steps were missing from the zigzagging staircase that led to the observation deck. If Emily had tried to climb this— "Hello?" he called out, pitching his voice to carry above the wind. "Emily. Winston, this is Officer Sullivan with the police department. If you can hear me, please make a sound." The tower groaned in response, metal contracting in the cold. Sullivan played his flashlight beam across the structure, looking for any sign of recent passage. There, about 20 feet up, a piece of blue fabric snagged on a jagged edge of metal, the same shade as Emily's reported coat. His radio crackled unexpectedly to life. "Sullivan, come in. Do you copy?" "I copy, Captain." The signal was weak, but audible. "I've found something. The old fire tower on the North Ridge. Signs of recent access. That structure was condemned months ago. You're not thinking of already on my way up." Sullivan tucked the radio away and tested the first step. The metal shrieked but held. "Emily," he called again. "My name's Jim. I'm here to help." Was that a whimper from above? Sullivan paused, straining to hear over the wind. Then he caught it again, a small, frightened sound that any other searcher might have missed. But he'd spent 15 years working with Rex, learning to pick out the subtlest audio clues. "I'm coming up, Emily. Just stay where you are." The climb was treacherous. Every few steps, metal flakes crumbled under his boots, falling away into darkness. The wind grew stronger with each foot of elevation, threatening to tear him from his precarious perch. But Sullivan kept moving, placing each foot with deliberate care, using his free hand to test each rusted support before trusting it with his weight. 30 feet up, he found the first clear evidence. Tiny footprints in the dust of a landing, leading higher. Fresh scratches in the rust where small hands had gripped the railing. Emily had managed this same climb in the dark, driven by some desperate need to reach the top. The observation deck was another 10 feet above him. The final section of stairs had partially broken away from the tower's frame, hanging at an angle that made Sullivan's stomach lurch, but those small footprints continued upward, and so must he. "Emily," he tried. Again, closer now. "Can you hear me?" This time the response was clearer. "Help!" Sullivan's heart jumped. The voice was weak but unmistakably that of a young child. He inched around the broken section of stairs, pressing himself flat against the tower's frame. One wrong step here would be fatal. The observation deck, when he finally reached it, was in better shape than the stairs, built on a more solid framework, protected somewhat from the elements. His flashlight beam revealed walls of clouded plexiglass, many cracked, but still offering some shelter from the wind. And there, huddled in the farthest corner, was a small figure in a blue coat. "Emily?" Sullivan kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "I'm a police officer. I'm here to help you." The girl lifted her head slightly. Her face was pale with cold, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that set off alarm bells in Sullivan's mind. She was alive, but hypothermia was setting in. "How?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "How did you find me?" Sullivan moved carefully, across the deck, testing each step before putting his full weight down. "I had help from my partner." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the red mitten, still mysteriously warm. "I believe this belongs to you?" Emily's eyes widened slightly. "Your partner, was he a dog?" Sullivan froze in the act of pulling out his emergency blanket. "What do you mean?" I saw him, she mumbled, her words slightly slurred from cold. A glowing dog. He kept checking on me, keeping me awake, said his handler was coming. Her eyes started to drift shut. Hey, stay with me, Sullivan said sharply, draping the blanket around her shoulders. So Rex had been here too, watching over her while leading Sullivan to the tower. Even in death, his partner hadn't forgotten the first rule of search and rescue: protect the victim at all costs. The radio squawked. Sullivan, status report. He keyed the mic. I've found her, alive but hypothermic. Need immediate medical evacuation at the fire tower. He looked at the broken stairs below. And Captain, we're going to need the helicopter. Getting up was hard. Enough. Getting down is going to be impossible. The frozen pocket watch in Emily's hand had stopped at 7:42, marking the moment she'd reached the tower's summit. Sullivan studied it as he worked, the antique silver case reflecting his flashlight. Beam. My grandmother's, Emily managed to explain through chattering teeth. I was trying to find her old house. She always said she could see it from up here. Sullivan tucked the thermal blanket more tightly around her small form, recognizing the early signs of paradoxical undressing, the confused attempt of hypothermia victims to remove clothing despite the cold. He'd already had to stop her twice from pulling off her coat. Your grandmother lived around here? He asked, trying to keep her engaged while checking her pulse. Too slow, skin too pale. The wind howled through cracks in the plexiglass walls, and his radio crackled with static-filled updates about the approaching rescue helicopter. Summer house, when Mom was little, Emily's words were becoming more slurred, was supposed to be a surprise. Found the deed in Mom's desk, Sullivan's mind raced. The property deed he'd found below, Whittaker family. Your grandmother was a Whittaker? Emily managed a small nod. Mom said, could never visit. Too dangerous now. But I thought, if I could just find it, nay. Hey, stay with me, Sullivan interrupted sharply as her eyes began to drift shut. He pulled out his radio again. Dispatch, what's the ETA on that chopper? Weather's slowing them. Oh, down, Martinez's voice crackled back. 15 minutes minimum. Sullivan looked at Emily's bluish lips, the way her shivering had become less violent, a dangerous sign. They might not have 15 minutes. A sudden gust of wind rattled the towers. Frame and Emily whimpered. The dog. Where did the glowing dog go? Tell me about him, Sullivan encouraged, rubbing her arms through the blanket to generate friction heat. The dog you saw. Big. German shepherd. Her voice strengthened slightly at the memory. Kept pushing me toward the corner, away from the wind. Wouldn't let me sleep. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Said his partner was the best finder in the department. Sullivan's throat tightened. Even as a spirit, Rex had remembered their training, keeping victims talking, protecting them from exposure, maintaining contact until help arrived. That was Rex, he said softly. He was my partner for 15 years. Was. Emily's eyes focused, briefly. What happened to him? He died saving another little girl. Sullivan kept up the steady rhythm of friction warming. Just like he helped save you tonight. The tower shuddered again in the wind, and a new sound cut through the darkness. The distant thrum of helicopter blades. Sullivan's radio came to life. Air support is incoming. How's your passenger holding up? He checked Emily's pulse again. Still too slow but steady. Conscious but hypothermic. We'll need an immediate airlift. Copy that. Be advised, Windsor. Making this extremely challenging. Pilot says the tower's structure may not handle a direct hover. Sullivan looked at the observation deck's narrow space, then at Emily's semi-conscious form. A standard helicopter rescue would be impossible here. There wasn't room to maneuver a basket, and the tower's frame might not support the downdraft. As if reading his thoughts, Emily stirred. Are we going to die up here? No, Sullivan said, firmly. My partner didn't come back from the dead just to have us fail now. He keyed his radio again. Captain, tell the pilot to hold position 50 feet out. I've got an idea. The helicopter's sound grew louder, and Sullivan saw its searchlight pierce the darkness. He carefully gathered Emily in his arms, blanket and all. "I need you to hold. Onto me very tight, okay? Like a koala bear. Can you do that?" She nodded weakly, wrapping her arms around his neck. The pocket watch slipped from her grip, but Sullivan caught it one-handed, tucking it securely in his jacket. Some things weren't meant to be lost. The helicopter hung in the night sky like a giant mechanical dragonfly, its searchlight illuminating the tower's skeletal frame. The wind from its rotors created a maelstrom of ice crystals and rusty flakes. But as Sullivan stood, securing Emily against his chest, he saw something else in the swirling chaos. A familiar, luminous shape taking form between them and the helicopter. Rex's ghost stood at the edge of the observation deck, his spectral form brighter than Sullivan had seen it all night. The message in his partner's eyes was clear: "I've got your back. One last time." Sullivan tightened his grip on Emily and stepped toward the edge. Sometimes trust meant believing in the impossible. Sometimes faith meant knowing that even death couldn't stop a true partner from seeing the mission through. The emergency medical kit hung half-empty at Sullivan's side, its supplies depleted from his attempts to stabilize Emily. Now, standing at the edge of the observation deck with the helicopter's searchlight blinding him, he had to trust in something beyond standard rescue protocols. "Whatever happens," he shouted over the rotor wash to Emily, "don't let go of me, understand?" He felt her nod against his chest, her arms tightening weakly around his neck. The helicopter held position about 50 feet out, its massive rotors fighting the wind that threatened to dash it against the tower. Even from here, Sullivan could see the strain on the pilot's face. Rex's ghost stood at the deck's edge, his luminous form creating a beacon through the swirling snow and rotor wash. The spectral dog's presence seemed to push back the chaos, creating a pocket of relative calm in the maelstrom. Sullivan's radio crackled. "Jim, this is insane." Martinez's voice carried equal parts fear and frustration. "Wait for the wind to die down. We'll find another way." But Sullivan could feel Emily's grip weakening, her body temperature still dropping despite everything he'd done. There wasn't time for another way. "Emily," he said close to her ear, "I need you to do something for me. There's a dog out there, a glowing dog. Can you see him?" She lifted her head slightly, eyes struggling to focus, like before. "He's showing us the way?" "That's right, he's going to help us, just like he helped me find you." Sullivan took a deep breath, feeling the tower sway beneath them. "When I move, keep your eyes on him. Just look at Rex, nothing else. Can you do that?" Another weak nod. Sullivan keyed his radio one last time. "Captain, we're coming out. Have your crew ready?" He heard Martinez start to protest, but the words were lost in the wind. Rex's ghost had moved to the very edge of the platform now, his spectral form blazing with an inner light that seemed to cut through the darkness. In life, Sullivan had trusted his partner with his life countless times. In death, he would do no less. The first step was the hardest, moving from the relative security of the observation deck onto the narrow maintenance walkway. The metal grating shifted underfoot, weakened by decades of exposure. Sullivan kept, his eyes locked on Rex's glowing form, letting muscle memory guide his feet, 20 feet to the edge. The helicopter's downdraft created a violent turbulence, but somehow the worst of it seemed to part around them, as if Rex's presence was somehow shielding them from the full force of the wind. 15 feet. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps. Against his neck, the dog. He's getting brighter. 10 feet. The walkway groaned ominously. A section of railing torn free by the wind crashed into the darkness below. Sullivan felt Emily flinch but kept moving, trusting his partner's guidance. 5 feet. Rex's ghost stood at the final gap between the tower and salvation, his form now brilliantly incandescent. The helicopter had edged as close as it dared, its crew chief visible in the open door, rescue harness at the ready. "Now or never, partner," Sullivan whispered. The final section of walkway gave way just as he launched himself forward. For one eternal moment, they were suspended in space, the ground an impossible distance below. Emily's scream was lost in the roar of wind and rotors. But through it all, Rex's ghostly form blazed like a star, marking the path to safety. Strong hands grabbed them, pulling them into the helicopter's cabin. Sullivan rolled to protect Emily from the impact, his body remembering countless training drills. As they were secured, he looked back through the open door. Rex stood on what remained of the walkway, his luminous form beginning to fade. But before he disappeared completely, Sullivan saw his partner's tail wag twice, their old signal for mission accomplished. Then the ghost dog turned and walked into the darkness, his duty finally fully discharged. "Officer Sullivan?" Emily's voice was weak but clear. "Is he gone?" Sullivan held her close as the medical team swarmed around them, their emergency kit, replacing his depleted supplies. Through the helicopter's window, he could see the tower diminishing behind them, its dark shape stark against the night sky. But somehow, the darkness didn't seem quite so complete anymore. "No," he said softly, feeling the weight of her grandmother's pocket watch in his jacket, a piece of the past preserved, just like his memories of Rex. Partners like that are never really gone. They just wait for the next time we need them. The helicopter banked toward the hospital, leaving the tower and its ghosts behind. But Sullivan knew that somewhere, in whatever realm faithful spirits dwelled, his partner was still on duty, ready to guide the lost home. The cracked flashlight lay on the hospital waiting room table, its beam flickering weakly, a testament to the night's ordeal. Sullivan couldn't stop staring at it, remembering how its light had caught Rex's ghostly form in those final moments on the tower. The rational part of his mind kept trying to explain away what he'd seen, to reduce it all to tricks of light and shadow born from exhaustion and desperate hope. But Emily's voice from the treatment room down the hall kept bringing him back to the truth. "The glowing dog," she was telling the nurses. "He wouldn't let me sleep, kept nudging me awake when I got too cold, said I had to stay awake until his partner found me." Sullivan pressed his palms against his eyes, feeling the weight of 48 sleepless hours crushing down on him. His clothes still carried the scent of rust from the tower, and his muscles ached from the climb and desperate leap to the helicopter. But it wasn't physical exhaustion that finally broke him. It was the memory of Rex's last look before fading away, that familiar expression of absolute trust and devotion. "Jim." Martinez's voice was gentle as he settled into the chair beside him. "The doctors say she's going to be fine. No lasting damage from the hypothermia. You did it." "We did it," Sullivan corrected, his voice rough. "Rex and I." A long silence followed. Sullivan could feel his old friend struggling to find the right words. They'd known each other too long for platitudes about grief and imagination. "The helicopter pilot," Martinez finally said. "He filed an unusual incident report. Says he saw something up there. A light source he couldn't explain. Said it seemed to create a corridor of calm air that made the rescue possible." He paused. "Want to tell me what really happened out there?" Sullivan picked up the flashlight, turning it over in his hands. The crack in its lens had come from their impact inside the helicopter, the last physical evidence of their leap into a darkness. "Would you believe me if I told you? 20 years ago?" "Probably not." Martinez shifted in his chair. "But I've seen some things in this job that don't fit into neat boxes. And I've never known you to be anything but straight with me." The words started coming then, like a dam breaking. Sullivan told him everything. Rex's appearance at the cemetery, the warm mitten that led them to the search, the way his partner's ghost had guided them to the tower, how Rex had stayed with Emily, keeping her alive through the night, the final blazing moments during the rescue. When he finished, Martinez was silent for a long time. Down the hall, they could hear Emily's parents talking with the doctors, their voices thick with tears of relief and gratitude. "You know what this means, don't you?" Martinez finally said. Sullivan tensed, waiting for the inevitable suggestion of psychiatric evaluation or extended leave. Instead, his friend smiled. It means Rex is still the best damn K9 officer this department has ever had. Even death couldn't make him quit. Something broke inside Sullivan then. Not the sharp pain of loss he'd been carrying, but the softer ache of acceptance. Tears came, and for the first time since Rex's death, he didn't try to hold them back. Martinez's hand on his shoulder was steady, grounding him as the emotion rolled through. "I keep thinking," Sullivan managed after a while, "about all the people out there who need finding. Who's going to help them now? Maybe that's not the question you should be asking." Martinez picked up the flashlight, its beam strengthening, unexpectedly, as he turned it on. "Maybe you should be asking who Rex would want to help them." Sullivan looked up, understanding slowly dawning. The department's got 3 new K9 handlers in training, and no one better qualified to teach them than you. Martinez stood, offering his hand. "What do you say? Ready to help create some new partnerships?" Before Sullivan could answer, a nurse appeared in the hallway. "Officer Sullivan, Emily's asking for you. Says she has something that belongs to you." In the treatment room, Emily sat propped up with blankets, color finally returning to her face. In her hands, she held 2 items, her grandmother's pocket watch and a familiar tennis ball, worn and dirty but unmistakable. "I found this up in the tower," she said, holding out the ball. "The dog, Rex, he used it to keep me awake. We played fetch until I couldn't move my arms anymore. I thought, maybe you should have it back." Sullivan took the ball, feeling its familiar weight, the same ball that had been buried with Rex 3 weeks ago. He looked at his reflection in the watch's silver case, seeing not just grief there now, but purpose. "Actually," he said, "I think I might know some new K9 recruits who could use this for training. If you don't mind?" Emily smiled, understanding, in her young face. "I think Rex would like that." The first light photograph captured by the hospital security cameras showed an exhausted Sullivan standing at the emergency room entrance as dawn broke, watching the arrival of his fellow officers. The image would later become iconic within the department, a man balanced between night and day, between the extraordinary events he'd experienced and the normal world rushing back in. "They're calling it a miracle," Detective Chen said, joining him at the window. She'd been the first to arrive after Emily's parents, her own daughter's rescue still fresh in her memory. "The way you found her, getting her off that tower. Even the chief is having trouble explaining it in his report." Sullivan watched the sun climbing over the hospital's parking lot, painting the frost-covered cars in shades of gold. The nights. Events felt almost dreamlike now, but the tennis ball in his pocket was solid proof that something remarkable had happened. The hospital corridor behind them bustled with activity. Emily's doctors were conferring with specialists, amazed at her condition. Despite hours of exposure, she showed no signs of lasting damage. Her core temperature was maintained just enough, they murmured, as if something kept her moving, kept her blood flowing. Officer Sarah Martinez, the captain's daughter and one of the new K9 handlers in training, approached with barely contained excitement. "Is it true? About Rex?" Her young Belgian Malinois, Shadow, sat alertly at her heel. "Dad called me as soon as you were safe," he said. She hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. "He said Rex came back to help with the search." Sullivan looked down at Shadow, seeing the same eager intelligence in his eyes that Rex had shown at that age. The young dog returned his gaze steadily, then did something that made Sullivan's breath catch. He turned his head and stared directly at the empty space beside his handler, ears perked forward with intense interest. "What is it, boy?" Sarah asked, following her dog's gaze. "What do you see?" Sullivan smiled, remembering how Rex had always seemed to sense things others couldn't. Perhaps there were more mysteries in the partnership between handlers and their K9s than any of them truly understood. The hospital's automatic doors whispered open as more officers arrived. News of the rescue had spread quickly through the department, drawing even retired K9 handlers to the scene. They gathered in small groups, their voices hushed, sharing their own stories of inexplicable moments with their partners, instances of seemingly impossible intuition, of warnings that saved lives, of connections that defied rational explanation. Captain Martinez emerged from Emily's room, his face thoughtful. Just finished talking with her parents. They want to thank you properly once things settle down. He paused, watching Sarah and Shadow working on basic commands nearby. I've been thinking about what you said, about teaching the new handlers. Oh? Sullivan kept his voice neutral, but he felt a familiar stirring of purpose. The department's expanding the K9 program. After last night? Well, let's just say even the budget committee is convinced of their value. Martinez handed him a folder. How would you feel about heading up the training division? Full autonomy, your own facilities, a chance to shape the next generation of partnerships. Sullivan opened the folder, finding not just a job offer, but photographs. Rex and him training other handlers over the years, moments he'd forgotten but someone had thought to preserve. Their legacy was already there, waiting to be built upon. A commotion from Emily's room drew their attention. The girl was describing her night in the tower to a rapt audience of nurses and officers, her hands moving animatedly. And then Rex said, "My partner never gives up on a search. He's the best finder in the department." She looked up, catching Sullivan's eye through the doorway. He was right. The morning sun had fully risen now, its light filling the hospital. A corridor. Sarah and Shadow had moved closer, the young dog still occasionally glancing at empty spaces with curious interest. Other K9 handlers gathered around, drawn by Emily's story, but staying for something more. The sense of witnessing a turning point, a moment when the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary shifted just enough to reveal new possibilities. Sullivan felt the weight of Rex's tennis ball in his pocket, a tangible reminder of both loss and continuation. His partner had shown him one last time that the work they did transcended simple explanations, that the bond between handler and K9 could bridge even the ultimate divide. So, Martinez prompted quietly, about that training position? Sullivan watched Sarah working with Shadow, seeing in them the same potential he and Rex had once embodied. The young dog caught his eye again and wagged his tail, 2 quick sweeps just like Rex used to do. Some signs, Sullivan had learned, were too clear to ignore. The department commendation lay on Chief Harrison's desk, its gold embossing catching. The afternoon light. The citation read simply, "For extraordinary courage and dedication in the rescue of Emily Winston." But it was the handwritten addendum at the bottom that drew Sullivan's attention. With recognition of K9 Officer Rex's final service to the department. "Never thought I'd be signing a commendation for a deceased K9, Harrison said, leaning back in his chair. The chief was old school, more comfortable with facts and figures than unexplainable events. But the evidence from that night had proven impossible to ignore. The helicopter pilot's footage, Emily's consistent testimony, the mysteriously warm mitten, the inexplicable tennis ball, and most compelling, the night vision recordings from Sullivan's body camera. "I've watched that tower footage 50 times, Harrison continued, gesturing to the laptop on his desk. The way the snow and rotor wash part around you during the rescue, the luminescence that our tech department can't explain, and then there's this." He turned the laptop around, showing a still frame from the camera. There, clearly visible despite the grainy night vision, was Rex's ghostly form leading them along the maintenance walkway. The image had been enhanced and analyzed by experts, none of whom could offer a conventional explanation. "What am I supposed to put in my official report, Sullivan? That our most decorated K9 officer came back from the dead for one last rescue?" Sullivan studied the image, remembering the absolute trust he'd felt in that moment. "Put what you want, Chief. The truth is in the result. Emily's alive. That's all that matters." Harrison nodded slowly, then reached into his desk drawer. Speaking of results, the canine training proposal you submitted, the committee approved it unanimously this morning. Full funding plus extra resources for expanding the program. He smiled slightly. Apparently, having a supernatural success rate is good for the budget. The news spread quickly through the precinct. Officers who had been skeptical of Sullivan's account found themselves confronted with undeniable evidence. The night shift reported their canines behaving strangely, focusing on empty spaces with unusual interest. The department's other German shepherds seemed especially affected, showing heightened awareness during training exercises. Sarah Martinez's shadow had become something of a legend himself. During their first training session under Sullivan's guidance, the young dog had led them straight to a hidden training aid without any scent trail to follow. When asked how he'd known where to look, Sarah just smiled and said Shadow had a little help from a friend. The local media caught wind of the story, though the department carefully controlled what details were released. The official version spoke of exceptional canine work and Sullivan's decades of experience. But within the law enforcement community, the full story traveled through whispered conversations and shared evidence. Other departments began reporting similar incidents, canines sensing things their handlers couldn't see, leading rescues with unexplainable accuracy, showing awareness that went beyond their training. Sullivan found himself fielding calls from canine units across the country, all asking the same question. Had the bond between handler and dog evolved into something deeper than they'd previously? Understood. You've started something here, Martinez said, joining Sullivan in the new canine training facility. They watched as Sarah put Shadow through an advanced tracking exercise. The young dog moved with growing confidence, occasionally pausing to look at empty spaces beside him, as if receiving guidance from an unseen mentor. Rex started it, Sullivan corrected, fingering the tennis ball he now kept as a training tool. He just showed us what was possible. The afternoon sun streamed through the facility's windows, creating long shadows across the training floor. For a moment, Sullivan could have sworn he saw a familiar silhouette among them, pointed ears alert, tail held high with purpose. Then, Sarah called out in excitement as Shadow located the hidden target with uncanny precision. Dad says Rex is still with us, she said later as they reviewed the day's training footage. That all our canine partners stay connected to the work somehow. I didn't believe it before, but now... She glanced at Shadow, who had suddenly sat up, ears focused on something only he could perceive. Now I think maybe death isn't strong enough. To break certain bonds, the commendation would hang in Sullivan's new office alongside Rex's original badge and their accumulated awards. But it was the daily work that truly honored his partner's memory, teaching new handlers to trust their dog's instincts, to recognize that the connection between human and canine transcended simple training. Some of the rookies swore they could feel Rex's presence during difficult exercises, guiding them toward better understanding of their partners. Sullivan never confirmed or denied these stories. He simply smiled and reminded them of what Rex had taught him in both life and death, that true partnership knows no bounds, and that sometimes the most extraordinary truth is the one that can't be explained, only experienced. The new K9 memorial plaque gleamed in the setting sun, recently installed, beside Rex's headstone. In honor of all K9 officers, it read, whose service extends beyond the final watch. Below these words, an etched German shepherd stood alert, bearing an uncanny resemblance to Rex in his prime. The artist had worked from old photographs, but somehow captured something more, that indefinable quality that had made Rex extraordinary. Sullivan knelt beside the grave, no longer feeling the crushing weight of grief that had first brought him here. The grass had grown in fully now, softening the edges of what had been raw earth just months ago. He placed a fresh tennis ball beside the plaque, not as an offering of sorrow, but as a gesture of gratitude. You'd be proud of the new recruits. he said softly, settling into what had become a comfortable routine. Sarah's shadow is showing real promise. Sometimes, when he works, I see echoes of your style in him, the way he angles his head when he catches a scent, how he positions himself to guide his handler. He smiled, almost like someone's been teaching him. The evening air was warm, heavy with the scent of summer flowers. In the distance, he could hear the K9 training facility's activity winding down for the day. Young handlers and their partners heading home, carrying with them the lessons he'd passed on, lessons learned through 15 years with Rex, and one extraordinary night of supernatural partnership. Emily visited the training center today. Sullivan continued. Remember her, of course you do. She brought photos of her grandmother's restored house. The forestry service helped make it safe again. He paused, remembering the joy on Emily's face as she'd shown him the renovated fire tower, now transformed into an observation post for park rangers. She says she still feels you watching over the place. The rangers, too. They've reported seeing a ghostly dog patrolling the ridge on cold nights. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. In these moments between day and night, the boundary between worlds seemed to thin, just as it had during their final case together. Sullivan had grown attuned to these transitions, learning to sense when the veil might lift. As if on cue, the air around Rex's grave began to shift, taking on that familiar luminescent quality. Sullivan remained still, watching as his partner's form gradually materialized, not the desperate, urgent apparition of that rescue night, but a peaceful presence, whole and healthy as he'd been in his prime. "I knew you'd come," Sullivan said, quietly. "One last time, right, partner?" Rex's ghost sat beside him, close enough that Sullivan could almost feel the phantom warmth of his presence. The spectral dog's eyes held the same wisdom they'd always had, but now there was something more, a contentment, a sense of completion. "The department's changed since that night," Sullivan told him. "Every K9 team now trains for more than just tracking and apprehension. We teach them about the deeper connection, the kind you showed us was possible." He reached out, his hand passing through Rex's luminous form, but feeling that familiar sensation of warmth. "They call it the Rex Protocol, learning to trust what can't be explained, only understood." Rex's tail wagged twice, their old signal for approval. Around them, the cemetery had grown dark, but his ghost cast a gentle light that held the shadows. At bay, other K9 handlers had reported similar visitations in recent months, brief encounters with their departed partners during training or difficult searches. The boundary between natural and supernatural had become more permeable in the K9 unit, accepted as part of their unique partnership. "I don't think you'll need to come back after this," Sullivan said, understanding flowing between them as it always had. "The new generation, they're learning to bridge the gap themselves. Every handler and dog, building their own connection to whatever realm you've been watching from." Rex stood, his ghostly form beginning to fade with the last rays of sunset. But before he disappeared, he pressed his muzzle briefly to Sullivan's hand, one final contact between partners who had transcended death itself. The sensation was like sunlight on water, ephemeral, yet undeniably real. "Good boy," Sullivan whispered, his voice thick with emotion but free of pain. "Rest easy now, we've got the watch." Rex's form dissolved into the gathering darkness, but not before giving Sullivan one last look, not of goodbye but of continuation. Some partnerships, they had proven, never truly ended. They simply transformed, becoming part of something larger than themselves. The new memorial plaque caught the day's last light, its etched shepherd standing eternal watch. Sullivan rose, feeling not loss, but completion. He and Rex had shown what was possible when trust and devotion transcended all bounds. Now it was time for new partnerships to carry that legacy forward, guided by the knowledge that some bonds were stronger than death itself. The puppy training certificate on Sullivan's desk bore Shadow's name, but the achievement belonged to both dog and handler. Sarah Martinez stood before him, beaming with pride as her young Belgian Malinois sat perfectly at heel. The certificate represented more than just completed training. It marked the first graduation from what the department now called the Rex program. "He did something unusual during the final test," Sarah said, her expression thoughtful. "When we reached that blind corner in the search area, Shadow stopped and looked to his left, like he was waiting for guidance. Then he changed direction completely and went straight to the hidden subject. It wasn't what we practiced, but it was exactly right," Sullivan finished, remembering countless similar moments with Rex. He studied Shadow, noting how the young dog's attention occasionally shifted to empty spaces in the room, acknowledging something only he could perceive. The training facility had evolved over the past 6 months, incorporating lessons learned from that supernatural night. Sullivan had redesigned the programs, emphasizing not just technical skills, but the deeper connection between handler and K9. The walls now displayed photographs of successful teams, with Rex's image centerpiece, a reminder that some partnerships transcended conventional understanding. "You know what the other handlers are saying?" Sarah scratched behind Shadow's ears, her voice low. "They say on quiet nights, during solo training, they sometimes catch glimpses of a German shepherd watching from the shadows. Their dogs react to it, but they're not afraid. It's like they're being mentored," Sullivan supplied, thinking of all the subtle signs he'd observed. New K9s mastering complex techniques with unprecedented speed. Handlers reporting moments of inexplicable intuition during searches. The way the dogs sometimes worked in perfect synchronization, as if following an unseen conductor. Sarah nodded. "Dad says, Captain Martinez, he says Rex isn't just haunting the place. He's teaching." She paused, watching Shadow's ears prick forward with sudden interest. "Like right now, look at him," Sullivan observed, as Shadow rose smoothly and moved to a specific point in the training room, assuming a perfect indication pose. It was exactly the behavior they'd been trying to instill in the younger dogs, but they hadn't been training it. "Today, good boy," Sullivan said softly, and for a moment he wasn't sure whether he was praising Shadow or acknowledging his old partner's continuing influence. The afternoon training session brought more evidence of Rex's subtle guidance. Each K9 team showed improvements that went beyond normal progression. Sullivan watched them work, seeing echoes of Rex's techniques emerging in different dogs, the particular head tilt during tracking, the precise way of indicating a find, the protective positioning beside their handlers. Later, reviewing training footage in his office, Sullivan noticed something the cameras had captured, but human eyes had missed. In certain frames, when the light hit just right, there seemed to be additional shadows on the training floor. Dog-shaped shadows that moved independently, guiding the younger K9s through their paces. He'd kept Rex's tennis ball on his desk, using it occasionally to reward exceptional performance. Now he picked it up, feeling its familiar texture. "You're still teaching them, aren't you, boy?" he murmured. "Still showing them the way." The ball felt warm in his hand, like it had that night at the hospital. Outside his office window, he could see new handlers working with their partners in the evening light, each team moving with growing confidence and trust. The department's K9 unit had the highest success rate in the state now. Their achievements, defying conventional explanation. Sarah appeared in his doorway, Shadow alert beside her. "We're heading out on our first solo night shift," she said, a mix of excitement and nervousness in her voice. "Any last advice?" Sullivan looked at them, the promising young handler and her exceptional dog, and saw the future of everything he and Rex had built. "Trust each other," he said, "and remember you're never really alone out there. The best partnerships extend beyond the final watch," Sarah finished, quoting the memorial plaque. Shadow's tail wagged twice, the same signal Rex had always used, and Sullivan felt a familiar warmth fill the room. As they left for their shift, Sullivan watched Shadow pause at the door, looking back over his shoulder at something only he could see. The young dog's posture held a new confidence, as if receiving a final piece of guidance from an unseen mentor. The training certificate on his desk caught the last sunlight, Shadow's name shining like a promise. Sullivan had worried once about who would carry on their work, who would help the lost find their way home. Now he understood that Rex had already answered that question, ensuring their legacy would continue through each new partnership they helped forge. Some teachers, Sullivan, had learned, never really stopped sharing their wisdom. They just found new ways to guide those who followed, their lessons echoing through time like ripples in still water, touching each new generation with the truth that love and duty could transcend all boundaries, even death itself. The dual frame on Sullivan's office wall held two photographs side by side, Rex and him on their first day together, and Sarah with Shadow at their graduation. 1 year had passed since that supernatural night at the fire tower, but its impact continued to ripple through the department. The frame caught morning light as Sullivan prepared for today's ceremony, reflecting not just images, but the bridge between past and present, natural and supernatural, ending and beginning. Emily Winston stood at the podium, now 9 years old and confident, as she addressed the gathered crowd at the K9 Training Center's anniversary celebration. "Officer Rex didn't just save my life. That night," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled handlers and their dogs, "he showed us that some bonds are stronger than anything, even death itself." Sullivan watched from the side, noting how the K9s in attendance sat with unusual focus, their ears forward, aligned in perfect formation. Shadow, now a fully certified search specialist, had positioned himself at the exact center of the group, his posture mirroring the stance Rex had always taken during formal occasions. "In the past year," Emily continued, "the Rex program has helped train 20 new K9 teams. They found 38 missing people, including 12 children." She paused, smiling. "And somehow, they always seem to have a little extra help when the searches get tough." The handlers exchanged knowing looks. They'd all experienced it by now, moments when their dogs suddenly worked with uncanny precision, instances of intuition that defied explanation. The department had stopped trying to rationalize these occurrences, accepting them as part of Rex's lasting legacy. Sarah Martinez stepped forward next, Shadow moving in perfect sync with her. "We've learned that partnership doesn't end," she said, her hand resting on Shadow's head. "It evolves. Every time we go out on a search, we carry with us not just our own training, but the wisdom of every team that came before us." As if in response, a warm breeze swept through the training yard, carrying with it a familiar scent that made every dog's ears prick up simultaneously. Sullivan felt it too, that distinctive presence he'd come to recognize. Rex wasn't manifesting visibly anymore, but his influence remained, woven into the fabric of their work. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new training wing, dedicated to innovative search techniques developed since that winter night. The plaque bore both Rex's name and his final badge number, but it was the inscription below that captured the program's evolution, where instinct meets inspiration and partnership transcends all bounds. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Sullivan found himself back in his office looking at the dual frame. Emily had joined him, her grandmother's pocket watch, now restored, hanging from a chain around her neck. "Mum says I can start volunteering with the puppy program next year," she said, watching Shadow demonstrate a new search pattern to younger dogs in the yard below. "I want to learn everything about them, about how they know the things they know." Sullivan smiled, remembering how Rex had always seemed to understand more than training alone could explain. "Some things can't be taught," he said. "They can only be discovered together." A familiar tennis ball sat in a glass case on his desk, the one from the tower, preserved now as a reminder. Beside it lay fresh training balls, well used by the new generation of K9s. Each handler had reported the same phenomenon. their dogs treating the equipment with unusual reverence, as if understanding its connection to something greater than themselves. The afternoon sun slanted through his window, creating long shadows in the training yard. For a moment, among the patterns of handlers and dogs working together, Sullivan caught a glimpse of another shape. Proud ears, confident stance, devoted purpose. Then it was gone, but its effect remained. Every dog in the yard had shifted their position, slightly unconsciously adjusting their technique to a higher standard. "He's still teaching them, isn't he?" Emily asked softly. Sullivan watched Sarah and Shadow moving through their exercises, their teamwork reflecting both learned skill and something more profound. In their movements, he saw echoes of his years. With Rex, the trust, the connection, the understanding that went beyond words or training. "The best teachers," he said, "never really leave us. They just make sure we're ready to carry on without them." Outside, a new class of canine teams began their afternoon training. Their dogs moved with growing confidence, guided by both their handlers and unseen wisdom. Above them, the department flag snapped in the breeze, its shadow dancing across the training yard like a shepherd watching over his flock, ever vigilant, ever faithful, ever present in the work that continued in his name.